The evening sun cast long shadows through the smudged windows of the Red Stone Saloon, painting amber streaks across worn floorboards that had seen their share of blood and broken dreams. Clara moved with practiced grace between crowded tables, her emerald dress catching the fading light, making her look almost ethereal among the rough crowd of miners, drifters, and outlaws. To anyone watching, she was just another saloon girl, pretty enough to draw eyes but not remarkable enough to hold them. Her movements were precise, calculated, each step a careful dance learned through years of serving drinks and dodging wandering hands. But beneath her practiced smile lay something darker, a shadow that flickered in her eyes whenever the saloon doors swung open. The usual din of clinking glasses and drunken laughter suddenly shifted, like a discordant note in a familiar song. Clara felt it before she saw it. The way the room's energy changed, how conversations died mid-sentence, how even the most hardened regulars seemed to shrink in their seats. Duke Slater's massive frame filled the doorway, his black duster coat still dusty from the trail. Behind him, 5 men spread out like wolves sizing up prey, their hands hovering near holstered guns. Duke's reputation had preceded him to Redstone Ridge. 3 towns already bent to his will, their sheriffs in his pocket, their businesses paying protection money that left them barely surviving. "Well, well," Duke's voice carried across the now silent room, his eyes fixing on Clara. "Ain't you a pretty little thing?" He moved toward her with the confidence of a man unused to hearing no, each boot step echoing against the wooden floor. The other patrons suddenly found their glasses fascinating, no one daring to meet his gaze. Clara's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her serving tray as Duke invaded her space, towering over her. His breath reeked of cheap whiskey and cheaper tobacco as he leaned down, close enough that she could see the scar running along his jaw. "How about you and me get better acquainted, darlin'?" She maintained her smile, though it never reached her eyes. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy, sir. Perhaps one of the other girls—" His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with enough force to make the glasses on her tray rattle. "Wasn't really askin', sweetheart." His grip tightened, and for just a moment, something dangerous flickered in Clara's eyes, a look that would have made Duke think twice if he'd been sober enough to notice. But he wasn't, and as his men spread through the saloon, pushing over tables and harassing patrons, no one could have guessed that this simple saloon girl was about to become their only hope for survival. No one could have known that Duke Slater had just made the biggest mistake of his life by laying hands on the woman once known as Scarlet Rain. What would you do if you were cornered like Clara? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Clara's heart thundered against her ribs, not from fear, but from the familiar surge of adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. She forced her breathing to remain steady, careful not to let the mask slip. The weight of the knife strapped to her thigh beneath her dress was suddenly very present in her mind. "I said let go," she repeated, her voice carrying an edge that made several nearby patrons glance up, despite their best instincts to stay uninvolved. Duke's grip only tightened, his thick fingers leaving marks that would surely bruise, if she let him live that long. "You got spirit," Duke chuckled, pulling her closer. "I like that. Makes it more fun when they fight back." His free hand reached up to trace her jawline, and Clara had to suppress every instinct screaming at her to break his arm. Not yet. The timing wasn't right. Around them, Duke's men were making themselves at home. One kicked an elderly miner off his chair, claiming the table for himself. Another was behind the bar, helping himself to the good whiskey while holding the terrified bartender at gunpoint. The third was counting protection money from the cash box, while the others stood guard at the doors. Clara's eyes darted around the room, old habits kicking in. 7 men total, including Duke. 4 guns visible, probably more concealed. The nearest exit was 12 steps away, but the windows would work in a pinch. Her fingers itched to reach for the knife, but she forced them to remain still. She'd worked too hard to build this new life, to disappear into anonymity. "You're hurting me," she said, injecting a tremor into her voice, playing the part of the frightened saloon girl while her mind calculated angles and trajectories. Duke's weapon was holstered on his right hip, an amateur's mistake. His stance was wide, weight mostly on his back foot, another mistake. "Boss," one of his men called out. "Found their strongbox. Ain't much here." The thug held up a meager stack of bills, disappointment evident in his voice. Duke's face darkened. "That so?" He yanked Clara closer, his breath hot against her face. "Where's the rest of it, girl? Don't try telling me this dump ain't making money." "I'm just a servant," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "I don't know anything about the money." Her fingers brushed against her thigh, feeling the outline of her blade through the fabric. One quick move and she could end this. But the cost would be everything she'd built here. "Wrong answer!" Duke snarled, raising his hand to strike her. The movement shifted his balance, creating an opening that the old Clara would have exploited without hesitation. Instead, she forced herself to flinch, to play the part, even as her muscles coiled like springs ready to release. But then something happened that would force her hand, something that would tear away her carefully constructed mask and reveal the deadly ghost she'd tried so hard to bury. "Stop it! Leave her alone!" The voice cut through the tension like a knife, young and frightened but determined. Josie, barely 17 and new to the saloon, stood trembling but defiant, her serving tray clutched to her chest like a shield. Duke's attention shifted, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. "Well, what do we have here?" He released Clara's wrist, turning toward Josie with predatory interest. "Ain't you just the sweetest little thing?" Clara felt time slow down, watching Duke advance on the young girl. Memories flashed through her mind. Another young girl, another saloon years ago. She'd stood by then, too afraid to act. That girl's screams had haunted her dreams ever since. "Mr. Slater!" Josie backed away, her courage faltering as the massive man approached. "Please, we don't want any trouble." Her back hit the bar, nowhere left to retreat. Duke's hand shot out, grabbing Josie's chin roughly. "Trouble found you anyway, darlin'." His men laughed, creating a circle around them, anticipating their boss's cruel entertainment. "Let her go." Clara's voice had changed. Gone was the submissive saloon girl, replaced by something colder, harder. Something that made Duke's men exchange uncertain glances. Duke turned, still gripping Josie's face. "Or what, sweetheart? You gonna stop me?" His free hand moved to Josie's waist, making the girl whimper. Clara took one step forward. "Last warning." Each word carried the weight of graves, of gun smoke, and blood-soaked earth. For just a moment, Duke's eyes widened, recognizing something in her stance that set off warning bells. Then his pride took over. The slap echoed through the saloon like a gunshot, sending Clara staggering back. But even as her head snapped to the side, her hand was moving. The knife appeared as if by magic, and suddenly Duke was stumbling backward, his gun hand bleeding where she'd sliced the tendons. His pistol clattered to the floor. Clara scooped it up in one fluid motion, decades of muscle memory taking over. Before anyone could blink, Duke was staring down the barrel of his own weapon. "I know you," one of Duke's men whispered, face pale. "I saw your wanted poster. You're her. You're Scarlet Rain." The name rippled through the room like a shockwave. Duke's remaining color drained from his face as recognition dawned. Everyone knew that name, whispered around campfires and in saloons across the frontier. The woman who'd taken down the notorious Carson gang single-handedly. The ghost who'd disappeared 5 years ago, leaving a trail of dead bounty hunters in her wake. "Scarlet Rain died," Clara said softly, her aim never wavering. "I suggest you leave before she comes back to life." Her finger tightened on the trigger, eyes cold as winter frost. But Duke had never been good at taking suggestions, and what happened next would become legend in Red Stone Ridge. The saloon seemed to hold its collective breath, the silence broken only by the soft creak of floorboards as Duke's men shifted nervously. Clara's stance was rock steady, the gun in her hand an extension of her will. For those who knew what to look for, There was no mistaking her now. The way she held herself, the deadly grace in every subtle movement. "You're lying," Duke spat, though his voice trembled slightly. "Scarlet Rain was taller, older." He stopped as Clara's lip curled into a familiar smirk, the same one that had graced 100 wanted posters across the territory. "Amazing what 5 years and a change of hair color can do," she replied softly. Behind her carefully controlled voice lay memories of dust and gun smoke, of battles fought in the scorching desert sun. "Though I have to admit, retirement suited me just fine until you walked in." One of Duke's men, braver or perhaps more foolish than the others, reached for his gun. Clara's eyes flickered toward him for just a fraction of a second. "I wouldn't." The words carried such certainty that his hand froze halfway to his holster. Fragments of her past life flashed through her mind. The thundering of hooves across open plains, the metallic taste of fear before each gunfight, wanted posters offering $5,000 for her capture, dead or alive. She'd been younger then, burning with a righteous fury that made her both feared and legendary. "They said you died in that fire in Socorro," another man whispered, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The whole town saw it burn." Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. "They saw what I wanted them to see, same as they saw what they wanted to see here. Just another pretty face serving drinks. Nothing worth remembering." Duke's composure cracked further as the full weight of his situation sank in. His good hand clenched into a fist, knuckles white with rage and fear. "You think you can just walk away from this once word gets out who you are?" "Word won't get out," Clara cut him off, her voice sharp as a razor. "Because you're going to walk out that door, leave this town, and never come back. Otherwise—" She let the threat hang in the air, heavy with promise. The room crackled with tension as Duke weighed his options. His eyes darted between his injured hand, his nervous men, and the unwavering barrel of his own gun. Finally, he took a step back, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "This ain't over," he growled, trying to salvage some dignity. "You can't watch your back forever." Clara's expression didn't change. "No need. You'll be dead long before sunset if you don't leave now." The certainty in her voice made several of his men take involuntary steps toward the door. But even as Duke backed away, Clara knew this was just the beginning. She'd kept her secrets for 5 years, built a new life from the ashes of her old one. Now, with one act of defiance, she'd lit a fire that threatened to burn it all down. Duke's face contorted with rage as he reached the saloon doors. "Kill her!" he roared, ducking outside as his command unleashed chaos. His men drew their weapons, but Clara was already moving. She fired twice in rapid succession, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. 2 men fell before they could even level their guns. The remaining outlaws scattered for cover as patrons dove under tables and behind the bar. "Get down!" Clara shouted to Josie, shoving the girl behind an overturned table just as bullets splintered the wood where they had been standing. The familiar dance of death came back to her like breathing, the world narrowing to angles and distances, threats and opportunities. A bullet whizzed past her ear as she rolled behind a support pillar. The wood exploded inches from her face, sending splinters flying. Clara counted shots, waiting for the pause she knew would come. When it did, she spun out from cover, her borrowed gun barking twice more. Another man fell, clutching his chest. The fourth tried to flee toward the back door, but Clara's aim was true. He crumpled mid-stride, his gun clattering across the floorboards. The last of Duke's men, the one who'd recognized her, threw down his weapon. "Please," he begged, hands raised. "I got kids!" "Then go home to them." Clara cut him off, her voice cold. "Tell everyone what happened here. Tell them Scarlet Rain sends her regards." The man bolted, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. As the thunder of gunfire faded, the silence felt deafening. Smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the dust kicked up during the brief but brutal fight. Clara surveyed the room, checking for movement among the fallen outlaws. None stirred. Josie emerged from behind the table, her eyes wide as she took in the carnage. You really are her, aren't you? The woman from the stories? Clara's jaw tightened as she reloaded Duke's gun with practiced efficiency. Stories tend to grow taller with each telling, she replied, though her actions had just confirmed every whispered tale about Scarlet Rain's lethal accuracy. The saloon's patrons began emerging from their hiding spots, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. Clara knew that look well. It was the same one she'd seen in every town she'd ever had to leave behind. Duke will be back, she said, more to herself than the others. Men like him can't stand being humiliated. He'll bring more guns, more men. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at the door Duke had fled through. And this time, he'll make sure everyone knows who I am. Outside, the setting sun painted the street blood red, a fitting omen for what was to come. Clara checked her ammunition, mind already racing through scenarios and strategies. She'd tried to leave the violence behind, to be someone else, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. Clara worked methodically, helping Josie tend to those who'd been caught in the crossfire. Thankfully, none of the patrons had been seriously injured, a testament to her careful shot placement, even in the heat of battle. As she cleaned a shallow graze on an old miner's arm, the sound of approaching horses made her stiffen. "Sheriff's coming," someone muttered, and the room's atmosphere shifted again. Clara's eyes darted to the back door, calculating. She could slip away now, disappear into the growing darkness. But something kept her rooted in place. Perhaps duty, perhaps pride, or perhaps just bone-deep weariness of running. Sheriff Harlan Graves entered like a storm cloud, his deputies flanking him. His weathered face darkened as he took in the scene. 4 dead bodies, bullet-riddled furniture, and the unmistakable aftermath of violence. "What in God's name happened here?" he demanded, though his eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that suggested he already knew. She'd seen that look before, the calculating gaze of a man measuring the profit in her capture. "Self-defense," Clara stated simply, finishing the bandage she was applying. Duke Slater and his men tried to take over the saloon. Things got messy. Harlan's hand rested on his gun belt, inches from his holster. "Duke Slater, you say? Interesting. And you took down 4 armed men by yourself?" His tone dripped with suspicion. "She saved us." Josie stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "They were going to—" She stopped as Clara touched her arm gently. "It's all right, Josie," Clara said softly, then turned back to Harlan. "You know who I am. You've probably had my wanted poster in your drawer for years, so let's not pretend this is about Duke Slater." The sheriff's smile was as cold as a snake's. "Scarlet Rain, been a long time since anyone's seen your face. Last I heard, the bounty on your head was up to $8,000. 10, Clara corrected him with a hint of her old defiance, though most who've tried to collect it are feeding the worms. Tension crackled between them as the deputies shifted nervously. Everyone knew Harlan was in Duke's pocket, had been since the gang arrived in the territory. The question was whether his greed for the bounty outweighed his fear of Duke's retribution. Finally, Harlan spoke. "You got 24 hours to clear out of my town. After that, I'm posting new wanted posters, dead or alive." He turned to leave, then paused. "And when Duke comes back looking for blood, you'd better be gone. Otherwise, a lot of innocent people might get caught in the crossfire." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke as he left. Clara watched him go, knowing that running wasn't an option anymore. She'd spent 5 years building a life here, finding a measure of peace. Now she had a choice to make: flee again or stand and fight. And Scarlet Rain had never been good at running. The night wrapped around Red Stone Ridge like a burial shroud, but sleep was the furthest thing from Clara's mind. She sat in her small room above the saloon, cleaning her newly reclaimed weapons, a matched pair of Colts she'd kept hidden beneath the floorboards for 5 years, waiting for a day she'd hoped would never come. The moonlight caught the worn grips, highlighting notches carved into the wood. Each mark represented a life taken, a battle survived, a piece of her soul traded for survival. Clara ran her fingers over them, memories flooding back with each touch. She remembered the first time she'd killed, a cattle rustler who'd murdered her father. She'd been 17, naive enough to think vengeance would bring peace. Instead, it had set her on a path that turned Scarlet Rain from a grieving daughter into a legend that mothers used to frighten their children. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in, Josie," she called, knowing the girl's tentative pattern. The door creaked open and Josie entered carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting the cup down, her eyes fixed on the guns in Clara's lap. "Will you teach me? To shoot, I mean. If Duke comes back." Clara's hands stilled. "This isn't your fight, Josie. When trouble comes, you need to be far from here." "Like you ran?" Josie challenged, showing a spark that reminded Clara painfully of herself at that age. "This is my home. I won't abandon it." Clara sighed, holstering one of the Colts. "Running isn't always about fear. Sometimes it's about living to fight another day." She stood, walking to the window that overlooked the main street. "I've killed more men than I can count, Josie. Each time I told myself they deserved it, that I was cleaning up the frontier, making it safer." She turned back to the girl, her eyes haunted. "But violence changes you. Each death takes something you can't get back. I don't want that for you." "But you'll stay and fight?" Josie asked softly. Clara nodded slowly. "I'm already damned. Might as well make it count for something." She picked up the coffee, inhaling the rich aroma. "Besides, Duke won't stop with just this town. He'll keep pushing, keep hurting people until someone stops him." "Then teach me," Josie insisted. "Not just shooting. Teach me to survive. You did it for 5 years without anyone knowing who you were. Show me how." Clara studied the young woman before her, seeing the same determination she'd once had, before the weight of her legend had carved those notches into her soul. Perhaps this was her chance for redemption. Not through more violence, but by passing on the knowledge that had kept her alive. "All right," she finally agreed. "But you follow my rules exactly as I say. This isn't about revenge or glory. It's about survival." Dawn had barely broken over the horizon when the warning came. Riders approaching from the south, more than a dozen by the dust cloud they kicked up. Clara stood on the saloon's balcony, Josie at her side, watching the approaching storm. But it was one particular figure among the riders that made Clara's blood run cold. Even at this distance, she'd recognize that distinctive red bandana and the way the rider sat a horse. Straight-backed, proud, deadly. "Cass," she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "You know them?" Josie asked, noticing how Clara's hand had unconsciously moved to her holster. "Cass Black," Clara replied, her voice tight with old pain. "Once my closest friend, now one of the deadliest bounty hunters in the territory." She turned to Josie. "Get everyone out the back, now." The riders pulled up in front of the saloon in a cloud of dust and tension. Duke sat smugly on his horse, his injured hand bandaged, but it was Cass who commanded attention. Time had added silver streaks to her dark hair, but her eyes were the same, sharp as a hawk's, and twice as merciless. "Hello, Clara," Cass called out, her voice carrying easily in the morning stillness. "Or should I say Scarlet? Been a long time." "Not long enough," Clara responded, keeping her tone level despite the hurricane of emotions in her chest. "Still doing other people's dirty work, I see." Cass's smile was cold as a desert night. "Says the woman hiding behind a serving tray. At least I never pretended to be something I'm not." Memories flooded back. Midnight raids, shared victories, promises of loyalty sealed with blood. Then came the betrayal at Yellow Fork, where greed had turned partnership into bitter enmity. "What's your price these days, Cass?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "Duke's gold worth more than our history?" 10,000 dead, 15 alive, Cass replied, "plus whatever's left of the old bounty." But for you, old friend, I'll make it quick if you surrender now." Clara's laugh was hollow. "You always underestimate me. That's why I walked away at Yellow Fork, and that's why you'll never collect this bounty." "You didn't walk away," Cass's voice hardened. "You ran, left me bleeding in the dirt while you played dead and built this pretty little lie of a life." "You pulled your gun first," Clara reminded her. "Over money? After everything we'd been through?" Duke, clearly irritated at being forgotten, cut in. "Enough talking. Bring her down or burn the place down. I don't care which." Cass's eyes never left Clara. "One last chance for old time's sake. Surrender or watch everything you've built here turn to ash." Clara's response was to draw both Colts in one fluid motion. "You want me, Cass? Come and get me. Just like old times." The sun climbed higher in the sky as tension coiled like a rattlesnake between the two former friends. Clara kept her guns trained on Cass, even as Duke's men spread out, surrounding the saloon. "You're outnumbered," Cass stated flatly. "Even you can't take on all of us." A door creaked behind Clara, and she heard footsteps, not retreating as she'd ordered, but approaching. Josie emerged, a rifle in her hands, followed by several townspeople armed with whatever weapons they could find. "She's not alone," Josie declared, her voice carrying more confidence than Clara had expected after just one night of training. The young woman took position at Clara's right, the rifle steady in her grasp. "Well, well," Cass smirked. "Got yourself a new protege? Hope she's better at watching her back than I was." Clara's jaw tightened. "Last warning, Cass. Take your blood money and leave. This town is under my protection." "Your protection?" Duke spat. "You're nothing but a relic, Scarlet. A ghost story people tell to scare children. Times have changed." "Have they?" Clara's voice carried across the street like steel on stone. "Seems to me there's still men like you preying on the weak. Still vultures like Cass selling their guns to the highest bidder. Maybe it's time for some old-fashioned justice." More townspeople appeared, filling the windows of nearby buildings with rifle barrels. Clara had spent the night well, calling in favors, rallying those who'd suffered under Duke's extortion. "These people aren't afraid of you anymore," Clara continued. "You pushed them too far, and now they're pushing back." Cass's expression darkened. "You always did have a way of turning people against their own interests. But bullets don't care about pretty speeches." "No," Clara agreed. "They care about aim. And everyone here has spent all night learning where to point their weapons. Want to test how many of your men will fall in the first volley?" Duke shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, noting how many guns were now trained on his position. But Cass remained unmoved, her eyes locked with Clara's. "You won't shoot me," Cass said softly, almost sadly. "You didn't at Yellow Fork, even when you had the chance. Always too soft-hearted for your own good." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "People change, Cass. You taught me that." The morning air crackled with tension as both sides waited for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. One wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, and the street would erupt in chaos. Then Cass did something unexpected. She laughed. Not her cold, professional laugh, but the genuine one Clara remembered from their riding days. "Oh, Clara, you haven't changed a bit. Still trying to save everyone but yourself." The words hung in the air like smoke, a prelude to the blood that was about to be spilled. The first shot came from one of Duke's nervous men, a premature crack that sent a bullet splintering into the saloon's wooden frame. After that, all hell broke loose. Clara's guns roared in perfect harmony, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. Two of Duke's men fell from their saddles before the rest could even return fire. Cass dove from her horse, rolling behind a water trough as bullets chewed up the dirt around her. "Get to cover!" Clara shouted, pushing Josie behind a thick wooden pillar as the street erupted into a storm of gunfire. The townspeople, though untrained, made up for it with determination and superior positions. Their elevated firing points from windows and rooftops forced Duke's men to scatter. "The stables!" Duke bellowed, leading several of his men toward the wooden structure for better cover. But Clara had anticipated this move. The moment they reached the stable doors, hidden shooters from the hayloft opened fire, cutting down 2 more of Duke's gang. Through the chaos, Clara kept track of Cass. Her old partner was moving with the same lethal grace she remembered, working her way around the edge of the battle. Their eyes met briefly across the gunsmoke-filled street, and Clara read the intent clearly. Cass was maneuvering for a clear shot. "Josie," Clara called out between shots, "remember what I taught you about covering fire?" The girl nodded, her face pale but determined. "Good. When I move, give me everything you've got." Clara waited for the perfect moment, timing her move between reloads. Then she burst from cover, guns blazing as she charged across the street. Josie's rifle cracked repeatedly, forcing Cass to stay down as Clara closed the distance. Duke, seeing Clara's advance, turned his gun toward her. But before he could squeeze the trigger, a shot from one of the townspeople caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Clara reached Cass's position just as her former friend rose to meet her. Their guns met in a deadly cross, each barrel pressed against the other's chest. Time seemed to freeze as they stood there, locked in a lethal embrace. "Just like Broken Ridge," Cass said softly, referring to their last job together before everything went wrong. "Except this time, there's no gold to fight over," Clara replied, her finger steady on the trigger. Around them, the gunfight continued, but they were in their own world now. Years of shared history, betrayal, and unspoken words hung between them like invisible chains. "You know only one of us is walking away from this," Cass stated, her eyes never leaving Clara's. "Doesn't have to be that way," Clara countered. "Help me stop Duke. Be the person I used to trust with my life." For a moment, something flickered in Cass's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or longing for simpler times. Then her finger tightened on the trigger. The world held its breath in that split second before death. Both women tensed, muscles coiled like springs, each waiting for the other to make the fatal move. But before either could pull their trigger, a scream cut through the chaos. "Josie!" Clara's heart stopped as she saw Duke dragging the girl out into the open, using her as a shield, his gun pressed against her temple. "Drop 'em!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Drop the guns or I paint the street with her brains!" Clara felt Cass's gun barrel press harder against her chest. But something had changed in her old friend's expression. A flicker of the person she used to be, watching an innocent girl being threatened. "He's going to kill her anyway," Cass said quietly, so only Clara could hear. "You know that." "Then help me stop him," Clara replied, equally soft. "For old time's sake." Time stretched like molasses as Cass's eyes searched Clara's face. Then, in one fluid motion, she spun away from Clara, her gun now aimed at Duke. "Let her go," Cass commanded, her voice carrying the weight of countless kills. "This isn't your play anymore." Duke's eyes widened in disbelief. "You treacherous bitch! I paid you good money." "You paid for Scarlet Rain," Cass cut him off. "But this isn't about her anymore. This is about a line even I won't cross." Clara kept her gun steady, moving slowly to flank Duke. "It's over. You've lost your men, lost your advantage. Don't add murder to your charges." Duke's hand trembled, his gun pressing harder against Josie's head. The girl whimpered but kept her eyes locked on Clara, trusting her mentor to make it right. "You think I'm afraid to die?" Duke snarled. "I'll take her with me. I'll take all of you." The shot came from neither Clara nor Cass. A single rifle crack echoed from the saloon's upper window, and Duke's gun hand exploded in a spray of blood and bone. He screamed, releasing Josie, who immediately bolted toward Clara. Clara looked up to see the old miner she'd bandaged earlier, his rifle still smoking. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Sometimes the student becomes the teacher. Cass moved quickly, kicking Duke's fallen gun away and training her weapon on his head. "Your call, Clara." just like old times. Clara studied the man who'd caused so much pain, now kneeling in the dust, clutching his ruined hand. The old her would have ended it right there. Scarlet Rain never left enemies breathing. But she wasn't just Scarlet anymore. "No," she said finally. "We do this right. He faces justice, real justice, not frontier law." Cass nodded slowly, a mix of respect and understanding in her eyes. "You really have changed." "We both have," Clara replied, holstering one gun but keeping the other trained on Duke. "Question is, what happens next?" The street was oddly quiet now, dust settling over spilled blood and spent cartridges. Duke's remaining men had either fled or surrendered, leaving only the core conflict unresolved. Clara kept her gun trained on Duke, while Cass secured his hands behind his back with a length of rope. "You think this is over?" Duke spat blood into the dirt. "You think a jail cell can hold me? I've got friends in every territory, connections you can't imagine." "Had," Cass corrected him coldly. "Past tense. Men like you, Duke, they only have friends while they're useful. Now?" She shrugged. "You're just another failed would-be kingpin." Sheriff Harlan appeared at the end of the street, his deputies flanking him. His face was a mask of calculation as he assessed the scene before him. Clara tensed, wondering if they'd have to fight their way through the law as well. "Quite a mess you've made, Scarlet," Harlan drawled, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Question is," Clara replied steadily, "which side of it are you on? Duke's empty promises or the law you swore to uphold?" A heavy moment passed as Harlan considered his options. Finally, he sighed and nodded to his deputies. "Take him to jail and send telegrams to every marshal in the territory. It's time everyone knew exactly what's been happening in our town." As the deputies led Duke away, Harlan turned back to Clara. "You know I should arrest you too. That bounty's still active." "You could try," Cass interjected, her gun hand tensing. But Clara raised a hand to stop her. "No more violence," she said firmly. "Sheriff, I just helped save your town. The people here know who I am now, and they stood with me anyway. Maybe it's time to let old ghosts rest." Harlan studied her for a long moment, then looked at the gathering townspeople, faces filled with determination, guns still at the ready. Finally, he nodded. "Scarlet Rain died 5 years ago in Socorro," he said deliberately. "Far as I'm concerned, all I see here is Clara, a saloon girl who helped save a lot of lives today." He tipped his hat and turned to follow his deputies. The tension slowly bled out of the street as people began to emerge from their positions. Josie ran to Clara, throwing her arms around her in a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Clara hugged her back, then turned to Cass, who stood awkwardly to the side. "Thank you," she said softly, "for remembering who you used to be." Cass holstered her gun with a familiar spin. "Don't get sentimental on me now, but—" she hesitated. "Maybe it's time I remembered other things too, like what it felt like to fight for something more than money." The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across Red Stone Ridge. For Clara, it felt like the dawn of something new. Not an ending, but a chance to reconcile who she had been with who she had become. A week after Duke's arrest, Red Stone Ridge had begun to heal. The bullet holes in the saloon's walls were patched, though Clara insisted on leaving 1 or 2 as reminders. The town had changed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. People walked taller now, knowing they had faced down evil and won. Clara stood in her room above the saloon, packing her few belongings into a worn saddlebag. Her matched Colts lay on the bed, cleaned and oiled one last time. She'd given one to Josie earlier, along with a final lesson about responsibility and power. "You're really leaving?" Josie stood in the doorway, her voice thick with emotion. "Even after everything?" Clara turned to face her young protege, seeing strength where there had once been fear. "Because of everything," she replied softly. "The territory's changing, Josie. Law's coming, real law. The frontier doesn't need legends anymore. It needs people like you, building something that'll last. But where will you go? Cass mentioned trouble down in Mexico territory. Seems some folks there could use help standing up to men like Duke. Clara smiled. Besides, 2 reformed outlaws might do some good, watching each other's backs. Footsteps on the stairs announced Henry, the old miner who'd made that crucial shot. "Came to say goodbye," he said, leaning on his rifle like a cane. "And to thank you, not just for saving the town, but for showing us we could save ourselves." Clara nodded, touched by the simple sincerity in his words. Outside, she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats. Cass, right on time. "You've got something special here," Clara told them both. "Something worth protecting. Promise me you'll keep building on what we started." Josie straightened, her hand unconsciously touching the gun Clara had given her. "We will. I'll make you proud." "You already have," Clara replied, pulling her into a tight embrace. Then she grabbed her saddlebags and guns, heading down the stairs one last time. Cass waited outside on horseback, looking impatient but understanding. The street was lined with townspeople, come to bid farewell to the legend who'd become their friend. Clara mounted her horse, feeling the familiar comfort of the saddle. She took one last look at the town, at the saloon where she'd found peace, at the faces of people who'd stood with her when it mattered most. "Ready?" Cass asked, adjusting her red bandana. Clara nodded, and they turned their horses south. As they rode away, she heard Josie's voice carry on the wind. "She'll be back. Legends never really die." A smile touched Clara's lips as Red Stone Ridge disappeared behind them. She wasn't running this time. She was riding toward something new. The woman known as Scarlet Rain had found her peace, not by burying her past, but by using it to forge a better future. The dawn sun painted the desert gold as 2 reformed outlaws rode into legend, proving that sometimes the greatest redemption comes not from changing who you are, but from accepting it and using it to help others. If you enjoyed Clara's tale of redemption and justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible stories of courage and redemption in the Old West. And tell us in the comments, what would you fight for?